Is my family haunted? Once upon a time in the early 20s or late teenage years of my mother, a strange and unsettling incident occurred. An experience that stayed with her forever. She was preparing herself to attend a party, and while in the bathroom, she had turned up the dial on the speaker to enhance her music listening experience. Suddenly, the speaker shut off, and when she checked, she noticed the dial was turned down, which meant that something or someone had moved it. However, she was alone in the house, so she couldn't explain how it happened. She left the house as quickly as possible, feeling unnerved and frightened. Fast forward to my own childhood and my parents' separation, which resulted in me visiting my father's home on weekends. My mother often confided in me about hearing strange scratching noises at my bedroom door. It didn't help that my bedroom was located in the basement either, which heightened my fear of the supernatural. Even now, I can't shake off the feeling that something inhuman is following me. One particular night when I was up late watching TikTok videos, I heard distinct footsteps coming from the upper floor of the house. However, my mother and brother were sound asleep, and my father wasn't there. As someone who frequently hears eerie sounds, I wasn't initially concerned. However, when I hear the sound of a drawer opening and someone rummaging through the kitchen utensils, my heart almost stopped. I called my father, who advised me to check what was happening. Although it was an unwise decision, I bravely went upstairs and discovered that there was no one there, and all the doors and windows were also locked. The event left me shaken, and it's an experience that I'll never forget. Interestingly, it's not just my immediate family that's experienced these strange occurrences. Several aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins and other relatives have reported eerie events also, leading to the question of whether my family in particular is haunted. Despite the passing of time, the possibility of a ghost or a supernatural presence in our lives continues to linger, and it's an issue that we have yet to fully understand or explain. Real or just coincidence and grief? My story. Okay, so the backstory. My great-grandmother was always said to be born with a veil over her, something with an amniotic sac. She lived with my grandparents in an old house that had tunnels, not connected to things, but hidden areas, and said to be part of the Underground Railroad itself. Most have collapsed over the years, though. It's been written about in local historians' haunted house books. My great-grandmother used to see men carrying bodies to the basement. She would always talk about the little boy and girl causing trouble on her side of the house, or them looking at her or her jewelry. One time, it was the boy asking for water. Frankly, many of my family acted as if she was crazy, the non-believing portion of my family. I was of the believer side of our family, and she passed one year, the day before Halloween. I fully expected her to appear on Halloween and be like, "See, you all called me crazy." Another incident at the house was with my grandfather, who was working outside in the heat and felt someone put their hand on his shoulder and tell him he should go inside. No one was there. Another time, while home alone, he wasn't feeling well while down in the basement doing some work. My grandmother got home and he was on the sofa and wasn't sure how he got there from the basement. Maybe 20 years later, I took my grandmother to a medium, a few times too, after her mom and grandfather had passed away. Every time, the medium would see a curly-haired little girl by me, and they'd ask, as if we knew her, and said she's really interested in you, and we'd all be stumped and move on. After 3 boys, I had a daughter. Unlike all my other kids, she had a head full of curls. We ran into the medium again, and when she was about to ask, she said, "That was her." My daughter was born and completely in her amniotic sac. The most amazing sight. Too bad we always forgot the camera. She had to be cut free from it, too. Her and my grandmother had this amazing bond. From the instant they saw each other until my grandma's passing, there was just this automatic comfort they found near one another. Not the way my daughter was with others at all. Till she was 6, my daughter had several moments that would make me stop and pause and wonder. Not just being born like my great-grandmother. When she was 3, she told me how she was so tiny as a baby that she used to rock me all the time. I tried to correct her that I rocked her, and she insisted she rocked me until I was so tiny and cute. I was a preemie. All I could think was, is she like my great-grandmother reborn? Crazy, I know. At one point, I got into genealogy and did my ancestry DNA, unlike every grandparent, parent, and kid, to see who had got what percentage of each. My grandmother matched all my boys just as you'd expect for a great-grandmother. My daughter shared more DNA with her than her grandmother. They came up as close, about closer than the great-grandmother. I found it interesting because the bond they immediately had. A few years later, in April 2020, my grandmother passed. For 2 years, till just past 6 months, my daughter would always say, "Great-grandma is here." One time she was playing alone in her bedroom, and I could see her talking and having a blast by herself, and asked what she was playing. She told me great-grandma's playing dolls with me. My grandmother loved dolls. Growing up, she was poor and had one doll, so she collected them throughout her life after that. I said to my daughter, "You are. That's great. You look like you're both having lots of fun," she said. "We're taking our pictures." So I humored her and I did. It was like a live photo on my phone, and when I looked at it, there was a white shadow all around one side and around my daughter's head. She's laughing, looking up at it. On the side, there's a white shadow shape of a closed hand. Maybe she was there. Or maybe I'm thinking too much and seeing things that aren't out of grief and finding comfort. The last thing my grandmother said to me when I was crying beside her was, "I'll be seeing you," over and over, and saying my daughter's name. She wasn't with me. It was a matter-of-fact sort of tone, like she was just going on a little trip. The next day she could no longer speak and passed soon after that. I have a few pics of what appear to be faces in my grandmother's basement. We took them when my son was remote, learning with COVID, and learning about the Underground Railroad. Something is mimicking my cat. I've lived in the same house my entire life, and many strange things have occurred there. But these recent events are just odd to me. My family rescued a stray cat, now my best friend, about 7 or 8 months ago. He's still young, about 2 years now, I believe. My mom has been someone who would have, for some reason, have dreams of events right before they would occur. She can't control them or anything, but there's sometimes the death of loved ones which would turn out to be true. So, I guess you could say she's open to the paranormal. I have experience of some strange things in the house, such as shadows waving at me. And I don't mean out of the corner of my eye. They would be waving directly at me. But that's all that happened when I was younger, so I'm still skeptical about the paranormal, although I have seen a UAP with my family when I was younger that I still have no explanation for, but that's a story for another time. Now, regarding my cat, there was this night about a couple months ago when my mom felt the cat jump up on her bed. She then felt the cat walk up onto her face, but she got annoyed and covered her face with the blankets, expecting the cat to be, maybe bothering her for food. The cat then clawed at the blankets, trying to take them down from her face. And this happened for about 20 minutes. This was until she was so annoyed she got up and turned on the lights. But she then saw that the door was closed and that the cat wasn't even in her room at the time. I was actually awake around the time when this was happening to her. I have trouble sleeping. And the cat was sleeping next to me that night. The strange thing is, I actually heard footsteps walking toward my door, which was closed. which then stopped as I looked at the door. I then heard them continue away from my door and toward the room where my mom sleeps. Besides the occasional knocking noises and footsteps, not much happened since. But last night, it seemed like something was messing with me. My cat was also sleeping with me last night, but right when I was about to fall asleep, I woke up completely. As I hear the noise, my cat makes with his claws when he's scratching on the carpet, kneading it, which is almost like a popping and tearing sound. I sit up and the noise suddenly stops. I lay back down, and when falling asleep again, the noise started up. I saw my cat wake up as well, and he began turning his head to look around the room to try and see what the cause of the noise was. At this point, I was just trying to ignore the noise and sleep, since I have school the next morning. However, my cat was just way more annoyed than me, and he got up and walked around the edges of my bed, looking around to find the source once again. The creepy thing is that the noise seemed to move around. At first, it sounded right outside my door, but then it sounded like it was in the ceiling above me, but then right underneath my bed. And the noise would just continue to jump around my room. My cat walked up the headboard of my bed, which is cushioned, and he did the claw-popping noise thing just for like a second, which was not normal, as every time he'd do that, he would do it for about a minute or so. But immediately after the second he did it, the other noise would stop completely, and then my cat stopped and laid next to me again, and we both went to sleep. Also, for the past couple of weeks, I've been having horrible nightmares. Sometimes I can't even remember them, but I just remember the fear I felt. And every time I wake up, it's a cold sweat, and I'm completely drenched. I don't know why all this is happening, but perhaps there's a rational explanation for all of this that I just don't know of. But maybe you guys have had a similar experience of some kind. I just need to get this out there. And I will update the situation if you guys want. But for now, this is what has happened so far. The eerie tales of my haunted workplace are enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Countless co-workers over the years have reported strange occurrences, subtle yet unmistakable enough to confirm the presence of something supernatural. As for me, I have my own story to share, one that's left an indelible impression on my psyche. As a night shift worker, I often find myself alone, trying to stave off the boredom and fatigue that comes with the job. My go-to activities include scrolling through Reddit and YouTube, or taking laps around the office to stretch my legs. One particular night, I was feeling especially restless and decided to indulge in a little dance party by myself. With my headphones on and a blanket draped around my shoulders like a makeshift cape, I was feeling invincible, channeling my inner Darth Vader and belting out his famous lines. It was during one of these laps that I felt a sudden tug on my collar and blanket, as if someone or something had grabbed hold of me. Assuming it was just a co-worker catching me in the act, I turned around with a sheepish grin ready to play it off, but there was no one there. Confused and a little unnerved, I checked to see if I had snagged on something, but there was nothing in sight. Then, as if to further spook me, a stack of printer paper inexplicably toppled over at the other end of the room. Needless to say, I scurried back to my workstation and never danced again. But that wasn't the only strange encounter I had in my life. As a child, walking to school on a foggy day, I saw a small black terrier walking a few yards ahead of me. At first, everything seemed normal, until I realized that the dog was not walking on the ground, but rather hovering a few inches above it. The sight of this ghostly dog threw me off balance. But it didn't seem to notice and continued trotting along on its own way. These experiences, along with the stories of my coworkers, have left me wondering, is my workplace truly haunted? And what other paranormal encounters await me in their strange and mysterious world? This happened to me when I was 9. My friend in the neighborhood found a Ouija board in his brother's stuff while he was away at college. He told me what it was and asked me if I wanted to play it with him. Trying to impress him, I said yes, and we went into his room and we tried it out. Nothing happened, and we were left a bit disappointed. Later that week, he called me and told me that he had looked it up and checked out how to use it properly and wanted to give it one more go. I agreed as I was more confident that nothing would happen. So we grabbed a bunch of scented candles and we placed them around the board and did the whole seance stuff. We asked the board if anyone was there, and if it, of course, went yes. We thought maybe the other one was messing with us, but we agreed to take it seriously because we didn't really care if it was a stupid joke or not. We asked the ghost what its name was, and it spelled out Owen. My friend asked if it was a person, and it went to no. We asked what it was, and it spelled out demon. I then asked to prove it. You know, that call in the intro of Finding Bigfoot? Well, that's the closest thing to what we heard from the garage. Keep in mind, it was only us in the house. It scared the shit out of us, and we ran out. We checked the garage, nothing. Anyway, a few weeks go by, and he tells me how he's having a paranormal experience. He feels like he's being watched whenever he's downstairs in the kitchen and living room. He feels someone sitting on the end of his bed every night. Every time he walks past the garage, he feels someone grab his wrist and pull it toward the garage. Whenever I went over, I always got the feeling that someone was looking at me from the ceiling. It was defiantly unnatural. Then came the scariest part of all. We were at his house playing Army in his room, while no one else was at home, and we began to hear heavy footsteps downstairs. Except whatever was making it had hooves. Sounds like a full-grown horse was walking around downstairs. Then we heard someone begin to laugh and cough at the same time. My friend ran over and slammed the door shut and we hid. We hid under his bed while I hid in his closet. Then it sounded like someone began scratching his door with one big claw, like the ones raptors have on their big toe. He started crying and I was on the verge of tears myself. My friend yelled, "Leave us alone, Owen, you're scaring us." It began to stop, and then we heard it run down the stairs. My friend got up and threw me out of the closet and grabbed the Ouija board that was in there with me. He ran down the stairs, ripped the screen door off of his gas fireplace, and threw the whole thing in there, put the screen back on, and went to turn it on. When he was about to turn it on, we heard a loud moan from the basement, which was right behind my friend. He flicked the fireplace on, and the board began to burn. And that was the end of that, and we played outside since. He was too scared to go back into the house until his parents got home. His parents got home and saw that he had burned his brother's Ouija board. They grounded him and threw the burnt board away. That was the end of the paranormal experiences in my friend's house. And that's why I'll never take part in one of those games again. I had a friend who lived 2,500 miles away. He had an incurable brain tumor, but was hospitalized for something somewhat unrelated. It was a grave situation, and I knew that he was in trouble. However, my life was just too hectic to give 100% of my mental energy, as I was consumed with work and my own life. Facebook well wishes and prayers were sent, and I expected him to recover and go back home. A night or two later, I awoke from a night terror/sleep paralysis, and there was a loud noise that sounded like someone was pounding on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. It was what you would expect from a SWAT team before they crashed in. That sent me into a state of semi-lucidity, and I entered into a waking dream. And in this dream, I fixated on my bedroom door, waiting for the intruders to burst in. The door slowly cracked, and a giant meaty hand squeezed through the opening. My heart was pounding, and I was in full fear of a cardiac arrest. I knew that I was dreaming, but it felt so intensely real that my body reacted accordingly. The dark figure's shadow filled the entire doorway, and the hand, for lack of a better description, waved at me like a small child's hand maybe might wave. I was both terrified and comforted, if that makes any sense at all. He was this huge monster who was both scaring me and trying to console me at the same time. Upon awakening in the morning, I described this to my husband, and I rarely have sleep paralysis, and it almost always corresponds to some specific event. I made coffee and went online, and sure enough, I found that my friend had passed during the night, during the exact same time that I had the dream. He was semi-conscious, and his family described how he was holding up his hand and waving at them from the hospital bed. My friend was a giant man, and, in retrospect, the huge shadow and large meaty hand were exactly the same size his would have been. Now for the kicker. A few weeks later, I went back through our messages and found out where, about 2 years earlier, I had invited him and his wife to come visit and stay with us. His reply was, "Some night you'll have to wake up to a knock, knock, knock on your door." This story is 100% true, and I'm having goosebumps and tears just thinking about it. In Queens, New York, I found myself in an ancient bar that could easily rival McSorley's Ale House in terms of age. This establishment had been opened in the 1800s, and it was around 4 in the morning when the bartender began to wrap up and the last few patrons trickled out. At that point, only myself, 2 of my friends, and the bartender remained. Technically, the bar was closed for the night. But as we were preparing to leave, something extraordinary happened. I saw a person walk out of the set of doors at the back of the bar, move along the wall, and disappear through the other door at the end of the room. Despite my greeting, the person didn't respond, and I couldn't help but notice that they were dressed in a rather peculiar manner. I knew for a fact that no one else was supposed to be in the bar at that particular hour, so I asked the bartender who that person could be. Strangely, the bartender hadn't seen anyone, but one of my friends had. When I pointed out the door where the person had come from, the bartender was adamant that that was impossible, as the room behind the door had been sealed up after renovations many years earlier. At first, they suspected that they were making things up, but then we approached the door to open it and proved that there was nothing behind except for a wall, and suddenly, the lights began to flicker for a whole minute, and during that time, 2 doors on an old wooden bookshelf in the bar flew open, and a book flew off the shelf with it. The temperature in the bar dropped significantly, and we were all thoroughly spooked, so we hastily closed up and left. Although I have had other creepy experiences in this bar, this one was the most vivid and witnessed by more than one person. I won't mention the bar's name to avoid turning it into a ghost hunting destination, as it's my particular go-to dive, and I like being able to grab a seat at the bar. However, many patrons have reported paranormal experiences there, and it's up to you to decide whether to trust the stories of a bunch of drunks. I used to be a skeptic and tried to write off past occurrences as coincidence, but after this incident, I'm a firm believer that that place is haunted. I grew up on an old farm. It was no longer operational, but the point is that we had a lot of land, a lot of old buildings, and a lot of people died on that property. Anyways, I was about 15 and I had a habit of wandering the property and seeing what I could find. Since not even my dad had seen every building on the property, and I wanted to find one my dad had never seen. I found myself in the junkyard, basically where everyone who owned the house dumped their scrap. And I liked wandering around and seeing all kinds of old useless crap. On one side of the junkyard was this pretty large sandy knoll, and there was an old wooden door on the knoll. My dad explicitly told me numerous times never move the door, and me being a stupid teenager, I moved it, thinking my dad or someone had buried a cupboard of alcohol or maybe a bunker. It was just a regular wooden door in the side of the mound. I shrugged and left, never thinking about it. The next week of my life, it was like hell was unleashed upon my home. Doors slammed, 3 windows shattered, plates broke, appliances stopped working. My mom got pushed down the stairs. My dog was always on edge, and the fucking nightmares. Night after night, I couldn't sleep because of them. I was being stalked by a massive moving darkness that got closer and closer to me every night. On day 5, my dad confronted me after the window number 3 broke, and I confessed to having moved the door. It was the angriest I'd ever seen my dad. He was livid, yelled at me like this and that, told me I had to go put the door back exactly how it was. I was scared shitless, having never seen my dad that angry before, and ran as fast as I could back to the junkyard. I moved the door perfectly back to where it was. The events happening at the house didn't stop instantly, but tapered off over the next few days. My dad finally explained to me that although he didn't know exactly what it was, he just knew there was something evil underneath that knoll, and that he'd been told by my great-grandfather to never move that door. After those events, I never went back to the junkyard. Still haven't. You can just feel something angry back there, and I never want to be there alone again. When I was about 8 or 9, my family and I lived with my grandma for about a year or so before we got a place of our own. During our stay there, I was forbidden from going into 2 rooms, the basement and the guest room of my parents' room. The basement I stayed away from because it was dark and scary and had a tendency to flood, but the guest room was even more creepy. It was a tiny room. I think it used to be my mother's room when she was a really little girl, and at the time of our stay, almost everything in the room was white. White walls, white dresser, white rug, white nightstand with a white lamp, and a big squishy white bed with lacy white sheets. I only had momentary glances into the guest room now and then, and occasionally stepped inside, when my parents weren't around at least. But I didn't touch anything or stay long, because the whole room just felt so deathly quiet and claustrophobic. I never asked my mom about it. I assumed she just didn't want me to get anything in the room dirty. Then a few years later, after we get a place of our own, my grandmother died, leaving most everything to my mom, including her house. My mom decided to sell it. The house was well over 100 years old, and she had no use for it. So for about a week, we would go to my grandma's empty house and tidy the place up, throwing away trash and hauling out old furniture. It was then that I'd gotten into the 2 forbidden rooms of my childhood, the basement and the guest room. The basement wasn't much. It was old, poorly lit, and looked like a mine shaft with crumbling stone walls and thick wooden support beams. Nothing much down there but old mason jars. My grandma used to preserve fruit as a hobby. Loads of rusty mouse traps, a wood-burning boiler, and a bunch of moldering books and newspapers. The guest room, however, was where I had a strange encounter. As my family was going about gathering trash and organizing stuff, I went into the guest room one last time. It hadn't changed much, except gathering a thin layer of dust. Out of curiosity, I pulled open the drawers to see what was inside. A couple were empty, and the rest had either spare bed sheets or old clothes that probably didn't even fit anymore. All white, of course. But as I turned to leave the room, I saw something next to the door frame. Something that was never there before. A single black spot on the wall. It was as big and as round as a silver dollar, and appeared to be casting a shadow rather than it being a stain or paint. But the only light source in the room was a single window, and nothing in the room would cast a shadow like that. To try and find the source of the shadow, I reached out and touched the black spot on the wall with one finger. Immediately, my whole body went rigid as a burst of energy rocketed down my finger and up my spine, sending jolts of unpleasant, cold shock through my limbs like a cold flash crossed with a lightning strike. Seconds later, I felt my whole body get thrown back, either by sheer force or by my fight or flight response kicking in. Once I got my composure back, I looked towards the wall and the spot was gone. I never told anybody about it because I wasn't sure if it was even real. Part of me thinks that perhaps it was a dream and I just got it mixed up with my memories. I've had dreams in the past that were so vivid, I thought they actually happened, but I still don't know. Can crystals be haunted? Throughout almost the entirety of my life, I've been captivated by the beauty and allure of crystals. However, my fascination with these precious stones stems from far more than just mere aesthetics. In fact, my parents gifted me with my very first crystal when I was still a child, and from that moment on, I knew that I wanted to know everything there was to know about these enchanting objects. Over the years, I've studied the various properties, benefits, and uses of crystals, gaining a deep understanding of how they can be used to enhance one's health, well-being, and spiritual connection. And even today, I continue to purchase and collect crystals as needed, seeking out new stones and expanding my knowledge with each acquisition. But lately, my attention has turned toward the realm of spirits as I find myself increasingly curious about the possibility that an entity may have followed me home from somewhere. I can't say for certain whether this being is malevolent or not, nor can I determine if I personally am being followed, or if something that I may have acquired has brought this entity into my home. In an effort to protect myself, I've purchased a set of crystals that are said to be particularly effective at safeguarding against negative energies and entities. And in addition to their protective properties, I also hope that these crystals will allow me to connect more deeply with the spiritual realm, enabling me to potentially communicate with that entity that may be following me, and to express my wishes to be left alone. However, a troubling thought has recently occurred to me. Can crystals themselves become haunted? As someone who's always felt a deep connection to the stones that I possess, I can't help but wonder if these objects, which I hold so dear, are susceptible of being latched onto by malevolent spirits or negative energies. And if this were the case, how would I even know if a crystal had become haunted? Are there specific signs or methods I could use to determine whether one of my beloved stones had been infiltrated by something dark? These are the questions that continue to plague me as I navigate this uncertain and potentially treacherous territory of the spiritual realm. There is something at my work. Allow me to elaborate on this eerie and spine-tingling experience that the author has shared with us. The story begins when the author started working at a restaurant half a year ago. Everything was normal and the author was not expecting anything unusual to happen. However, he had numerous paranormal experiences in the past and a firm believer in the existence of the supernatural. A few weeks after starting work, he began seeing black shadows moving from the corner of their eye. The shadows were not stationary, but they were moving, either running or walking away. Although he wasn't frightened by these shadows, as they knew that they were not just shadows and could have been attributed to being maybe really tired, and they couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. They began to notice broken glasses and plates around the dining area of the restaurant. Even though the author could see the cameras and always asked their colleagues if they had broken anything, the broken pieces kept appearing. The author mentioned this to their boss, but they seemed to brush it off and not take it very seriously. As time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and alarming. Just yesterday, when he was closing up the restaurant, and as they were shutting down all the machines, they heard the sound of a chair moving. They didn't see the chair move, but they heard it. They were alone in the restaurant with no guests, and the chef was in the kitchen, so no one could have moved the chair. In addition to this, smaller but equally strange things have also happened, such as the author hearing their female boss talking to them when she wasn't even working that day, or the front door randomly opening. The author is now left with the unsettling thought that something supernatural is happening in the restaurant, and they're wondering what to do next. They're worried that something might happen to them or worse, to the guests who come to the restaurant. The author's experiences remind us that there is more to this world than what we can see, and that sometimes it's better not to brush off our intuition, but to listen to it and open the possibility that perhaps the supernatural actually exists. I'm actually spooked right now, and I need advice. When I was a young child, my brother and I had a favorite game that we would play all the time, Marco Polo. It was a fun way to spend our afternoons, and we often played with a boy named Jeremy, who was just 10 years old. We loved playing with Jeremy, and he quickly became one of our closest friends. However, as time went on, Jeremy started coming around less and less. He eventually stopped showing up altogether, but my brother and I were still young and eager to play our games. We continued to play Marco Polo and other games, often reminiscing about our times with Jeremy. One day, my mother told us that we couldn't play with Jeremy anymore. She had never met him and was concerned about our safety, so she refused to let him come over for us and have him come into our house. My brother and I were upset, and we begged our mother to meet Jeremy so that she could see that he was just regular like us. In an effort to prove that Jeremy was real, we suggested that we meet him at the park across the street where we often played. However, when we arrived at the park, Jeremy was nowhere to be found. My mother was furious with us and grounded us for lying about a friend who didn't exist. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth about Jeremy. I discovered that the woman who lived across the street from us had lost a son named Jeremy many years ago. He had been playing outside during a blizzard and had frozen to death. Now, all these years later, in the year 2023, I'm 29 years old and still haunted by the memory of Jeremy. Recently, I was out drinking with my brother and younger sibling, and we started reminiscing about our childhood games, including Marco Polo and tag. As my little brother talked about our old games, I felt a chill run down my spine. I swear I heard someone say, "Marco," from somewhere in the room, even though I knew I couldn't be seeing or hearing these things. The memory of Jeremy still lingers with me to this day, and I can't shake the feeling that there's more to his story than what I know. Perhaps his spirit still lingers in the park where we used to play. Or maybe there's some other explanation for the strange events that seem to follow me and my brothers whenever we talk about our childhood games. Whatever the case may be, I know that I'll always remember the boy who played Marco Polo with us so many years ago. I don't believe, but just had my first unexplained experience, a few minutes ago too. Thoughts? So let me start by saying that I've never been one to believe a paranormal thing. I've always been a skeptic, and I've never experienced anything that could convince me otherwise. However, that all changed today. I was at work, just minding my own business, when I decided to take a quick trip to the bathroom. Everything seemed perfectly normal as I walked in and made my way over to the urinal. I walked past the mirror, which was clean and unremarkable, but when I finished using the bathroom and went to wash my hands, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There were two very clear handprints on the mirror, They were smeared down as if someone had just touched the surface and the water was still dripping down from them. What was most unsettling about the handprints was that no one was in the bathroom with me when I walked in, and no one came in while I was in there. I was the only one in the bathroom, yet there were these strange, unexplainable handprints on the mirror. To make matters even stranger, I work in a fine dining establishment. This isn't the kind of place where people just mess around in the bathroom, especially not during business hours. And the hands were much too large and too high up to be those of a child, ruling out the possibility that this was some kind of prank. Needless to say, I was shaken by this experience. It's not every day that something happens that defies explanation, especially not something as inexplicable as what I saw in that bathroom. I don't know what to make of it, but I know one thing's for sure. I'm straight up not having a good time. Is it looking for me? I'm a 33-year-old man from a very small town in the Czech Republic, and I'm a heavy smoker. Every night before bed, I go on a small walk to smoke my last cigarette of the day. Those who do this as well will understand when I say I love being alone outside at night. I just enjoy looking at the stars and otherwise misty clouds that cover the moon. I'm a bad singer, so this is also my opportunity to just be alone where no one can judge my little song. Sometimes I sing and sometimes I just hum. I like it because it makes me feel at peace before bedtime. A few days ago was different. It was a little later than usual and I had just stepped outside for my nightly smoke walk. But the cold made me reconsider, so I stayed by my door, huddled in my coat, and half-heartedly smoked my cigarette. As I stood there, halfway through the cigarette, I heard something that caught my attention. It was a man's voice singing a song. At first, I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but then I realized it was coming from somewhere nearby. I liked it because I always do that too. I just felt some weird me too, bro kind of way. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check down the block to see if I could hear it better. As I got a little closer, I could make up the words and my heart dropped once I noticed that it was my song. And not only that, I realized it came from the area where I usually start singing. Even though I always sing it, every night, someone might have just liked it. I noped the hell out of there, and I'm usually not a coward, but I finished my smoke inside that night. I know I sound like a pussy, but it actually bothered me so much that I haven't gone for a walk since. Last night when I was in bed, I was almost falling asleep when I heard it again. My song, sung by the same voice. But what's so chilling about this is that it was so much closer. Whoever this is he looking for me? Did he just like the little song? And did he develop the same kind of routine as me? Or is it a little darker than I hope? It's 10:30 a.m. as I write this. I haven't felt like this much of a coward in a long time. It just feels off in a way that I can't explain. The energy is way better now, and I'll gladly go outside, but the night's changed for me, and I'm anxious now. I just moved here, and I'm already ready to move out. Me and my family had just moved into a beautiful new home in a peaceful neighborhood, and we were excited to start our new chapter there. However, things started to get a little strange as soon as we moved in. It started with small things being misplaced, doors creaking on their own, but we tried to brush it off as a normal house settling or maybe the wind. But then, tonight happened. I was in my room just hanging out when I started to hear a strange noise. It sounded like someone was trying to open my door, but I figured it was just my little sister playing a prank on me. I called my mom and asked her to tell my sister to stop, but my mom told me that my sister and little brother were already asleep next to her. The noise didn't stop, even as I was on the phone with my mom, and that's when I knew something was off. Feeling uneasy, I left my room and went to my mom's room. I laid on the floor trying to shake off the fear, but then I heard a knocking on my door. It was faint at first, but then it got louder and more persistent. I was too scared to investigate, so I just stayed put in my mom's room. Earlier that day, when I was taking a shower, I noticed something strange too. The door to the bathroom was slowly creeping open, and I thought it was just the wind or something. But then after I turned the shower head, it just turned back by itself. And that was when I realized that something was not right in this house. I'm scared and I don't know what to do. It's not just me, my whole family's been experiencing strange things since we moved in. We've tried to ignore it, but tonight was a deal breaker. We need to figure out what's going on and fast before things get even more out of hand. Terrifying experience. Meaning? It was a time when I was a self-confessed night owl, staying up until the wee hours of the morning, enjoying the peace and quiet of the nighttime. It was during one of these late-night sessions, sometime a few years ago, that I experienced one of the most vivid and strange events of my life. It must have been around 3 or 4 a.m. when I was lying in my bed staring at the ceiling with an echo of lucidity. I remember feeling like I was suspended between two spaces, almost tiptoeing on the edge of consciousness itself. As I lay there, I looked over at my window, which had undrawn curtains that allowed the faint glow of moonlight to filter into my room. And then out of nowhere, I saw two softly billowing figures appear to flow into the space behind my curtains. There was no airflow, no explanation for their sudden appearance. It was as if they had simply materialized out of thin air. The figures were fluid and graceful, moving like flowing water as they strafed from the outer edge of my window to the center of my bed. I watched in amazement, unsure of what was really happening, but completely transfixed by the strange display before me. And then, with a sudden jolt, I felt myself sliding violently on my back toward the figures. It was like an unexplainable force was pulling me toward them, drawing me closer and closer until I was right on top of them. In that moment, the figures vanished, leaving me wide awake and extremely uncomfortable. I sat upright in my bed, heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The experience was impossibly vivid, and I still think about it often, wondering what it all meant and whether there was some deeper message or lesson to be learned from it. To this day, I'm still haunted by that strange night and the mysterious figures that appeared in my room. It remains one of the most bizarre and unexplainable experiences total, leaving me with more questions than answers and a deep sense of wonder at the mysteries of the universe. My aunt told me it wasn't my fault. The experience that I had was incredibly emotional and deeply personal. It was a dream, but it felt so real that I woke up feeling like I had truly spent time with my aunt, who had passed away almost 2 years ago. Her death was sudden and unexpected, leaving me with a lot of guilt and regret. In my dream, she appeared to me and told me that her passing was not my fault, and that she loved me very much. The words that she spoke to me were so comforting and reassuring that I felt a sense of peace wash over me. It's hard to put into words how much this experience meant to me. It was like having a chance to say goodbye properly, to have closure and to know that my aunt was okay, even in death. I've always believed in the power of dreams, but this experience was beyond anything I've ever felt or experienced before. It was like my aunt was there with me, holding my hand and letting me know that everything was going to be okay. Of course, I still miss her every single day, but having this dream gave me a sense of comfort and closure that I didn't even know I needed. It reminded me that even though we may lose the people we love, they can still be with us in different ways, and that their love for us is never truly gone. It was a beautiful and powerful experience that I'll never forget. Speaking with the devil. The incident began innocuously enough. It was 11 p.m. and the speaker was in the shower. Enjoying the warm water and relaxing, suddenly she heard giggling, which she assumed was her sister, but as time passed, an odd feeling crept over her, a sense that she was being watched, that she wasn't alone in the bathroom. She dismissed the feeling at first, thinking it was just her imagination, but the longer she stood there, the more real the sensation became. As she grew increasingly creeped out, the speaker made a fateful decision. She decided to speak out loud to whatever might be there. "Is anyone there?" she asked, her voice shaking. "If so, give me a sign." Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the bathroom into total darkness. The speaker was now thoroughly frightened, but she decided to press on. "Were you once a part of this world?" she asked, leaving the lights on for a yes and an off for a no. To her shock, the lights went off again, leaving her in the pitch black. At this point, her mind began to race. She had been raised Christian, but had never really believed in God until now. "Are you the devil?" she asked, her voice trembling. The lights went out once more, and this time they didn't come back on for 5 long minutes. When they finally did, the speaker was so terrified that she rushed out of the shower, slamming the door behind her. But the horror didn't end there. When she realized she had forgotten some jewelry in the bathroom, she reluctantly returned, dreading what she might find, and as she entered the steamy bathroom, she was horrified to see handprints on the mirror. But they weren't ordinary handprints, they were twisted and deformed, not remotely human. Since that night, she's experienced a series of odd occurrences that have left her convinced that her house is cursed. Lights flicker on and off randomly, doors open and close by themselves, and she wakes up unexplained bruises and scratch marks all across her. She doesn't have a cat, but the door to her room is always closed, making it impossible for an animal to have caused the marks. In short, the author is at a loss for what to do. She's convinced that something is haunting her house, and she has no way of proving it. The sense of unease and dread that she felt in the shower that night is never fully dissipated, and she lives in constant fear of what might happen next. Tales of the Stardust Ranch. After moving furniture and unpacking boxes until early evening, Jod Edmonds had finally decided to call it a day. He made his way out of the front porch, grabbed himself a beer, and sat quietly, surveying his new home. In addition to the 5-bedroomed building with a pool, the ranch that he and his wife Joyce had just purchased covered a 10-acre plot of land, a guest house, and 2 horse corrals. Sipping his beer, John noticed a movement in the undergrowth that lined the property's premise. A few moments later, a singular figure emerged from the tree line, walking with purpose across the open fields toward the house. John had not been expecting anyone, and when he noticed something long and metallic in the approaching figure's hand, he'd immediately retracted to grab his revolver. Re-emerging from the farmhouse, he began to walk toward the intruder, openly showcasing his weapon as a sign of warning. However, as he got closer, he found himself thinking that this must be something to do with the belongings of the previous owners, which had been left on the property. When John and Joyce arrived at their newly purchased property a few days prior, they found the premises were still filled with possessions left behind by previous tenants. When inquired, the agents profusely apologized and promised to speak to the previous tenants. When John returned the next morning, he found the house empty, but every fixture and fitting had been broken and deposited outside the empty swimming pool. The agents were called once again, but they denied any knowledge of this, claiming that they still had not heard back from the previous owners. After another day of waiting, John arranged to have unwanted objects disposed of, thrown out. As John pulled up a few feet short of the striding man, an uneasy silence hung in the air. The stranger was dressed like an army veteran, had unkempt hair, and bore a distinctly frightening expression. The rusted manchette on his hand held John's attention, causing him to keep his hand firmly on his gun. The man claimed to have worked for the previous owner, and John explained that the property had not changed hands. When John asked the man why he was carrying the rusted blade, he replied that it was for hunting monsters, a service which he had been paid to do. Throwing out a mocking burst of laughter, John told the man his help was no longer needed, as he had not seen any monsters around. The man threw his weapon to the ground and began to walk away, shouting that John would repent for his behavior before fading back into the trees. Unbeknownst to John, the Stardust Ranch's new owner, the strange man was not lying. Inexplicable vandalism. The initial days at the rural property went as planned for the first couple. They started receiving a steady supply of sick and neglected horses, and they had everything they needed in reach, as Phoenix was only an hour and a half's drive away. The first sign that indicated that the agents have not been transparent about the history of the property came when John tried to get its faulty telephone line repaired. Despite booking 3 different appointments, employees of the phone company failed to turn up at the property. After a formal complaint was eventually registered, an engineer reluctantly made a short appearance, hastily repairing the problematic line. When John demanded to know the reason behind the rush, the worker hurriedly explained that the ranch was cursed, causing the people of the local community to avoid it at all costs. Several days after this eerie conversation, however, John understood that not everyone was choosing to avoid his property. On his morning rounds, he noticed that someone had been tampering with fencing around the horse corrals. The metal posts had been pulled up out of the ground at several points, and they had been bent and twisted in some cases. The incidents continued, and the damage only got progressively worse. John started hearing strange humming sounds at night, whose source he couldn't find. One day he found out that the horse died, choked to death by a heavy iron post which had somehow been twisted and wrapped around its neck. As John wondered what could have bent the thick metal bar, Joyce broke down and told him that she constantly felt the presence of people in the farmhouse. She claimed to have caught sight of a shadowy figure which had followed her from room to room. The figure had appeared in Joyce's periphery and seemingly disappeared when she tried to focus on it. While John consoled her, citing the vandalism in the property, he was deeply concerned by the strange death of the horse, causing him to place weapons at strategic points around the house, apparently offering him easy reach. A period of calm followed before the circumstances took a terrifying twist. Shadowy figures. John was awake in bed one night, unable to settle due to Joyce's disturbing snores. While he lay staring at the wall in front of him, the shadows seemed to swell and contort, materializing a dark figure. The frozen, helpless man watched as the silhouette slowly made their way over to his wife's side of the bed. As the leading figure reached out towards Joyce, John suddenly felt his fear turn into rage, reaching down for his aluminum baseball bat beside his bed and letting out a roar of anger. He moved across the room in seconds, lashing out at the dark shapes that were now leaning over his sleeping wife. He let out a wild swing, hitting the nearest one with the metal bat before a high-pitched shriek emanated out of nowhere, causing the figures to disappear. The police were immediately called, but they found no evidence to ascertain John's claims. From this point onwards, hostile interactions with the shadowy figures started occurring on a weekly basis. While he struggled to watch over his wife by staying awake during the evenings, John began hearing deep humming sounds off in the distance. When he looked out of his window, he would often observe what appeared to be bright portals appearing in the middle of the night sky, illuminating the darkness. He further witnessed mysterious objects disappearing into the portals, which would then close behind them without leaving behind any traces. The portals John claimed that he was seeing. The nighttime intrusions of the shadowy figures continued. They often moved around in groups of 3, and they had the ability to pass through walls and locked doors. John described them as being 4 feet tall, and they were deathly cold to the touch. One evening, John saw the family's Rottweiler pursue a group of these creatures across the ground outside the house. It was able to attack one of them, which immediately disappeared into thin air before the poor animal choked to death. John would go on to lose 2 more dogs under similar circumstances. But these weren't the only animals to suffer, as some of the horses were also found mutilated. Final days at the property. Despite his best efforts, John couldn't stay awake all the time and often collapsed due to exhaustion. One evening, he had accidentally dozed off before suddenly jolted awake again with the feeling of pure dread. Joyce, who was fast asleep in front of him, was being lifted by a thin beam of bright light which was being projected from outside. Realizing that his wife was floating toward an open window, he immediately got a hold of his rifle before firing continuous shots at the apparent source of light until it disappeared. After this incident, John started handcuffing Joyce to the bed, but despite his best attempts, both he and his wife began experiencing periods of memory lapses. When they awoke, they would find inexplicable injuries on their bodies, resembling deep cuts which had healed over a lengthy period. Inexplicable injuries. Eventually, John contacted the local media, hoping that someone could help him get rid of the shadowy attackers. He participated in radio and television interviews and allowed research groups to visit the property. But the problems caused by the shadowy intruders persisted. Finally, after 20 years of desperately fighting back, John was forced to give in. He and his wife sold the Stardust Ranch in 2016 and moved away. John and Joyce are not the only people that have experienced strange happenings on the property. During the 70s, the ranch played home to Gina Irons and her family. When John went public, she came forward to speak to the media about her past experiences. She described encountering ghostly figures which invaded their home, with her and her younger brother, feeling temperatures instantly drop whenever the figures passed across. A research team began encountering a thin humanoid figure that allegedly darted past them and disappeared into the undergrowth. When investigations searched the area, they discovered a stone with a mysterious star-shaped carving on it. In 2013, John was put in contact with William, a biologist, by a mutual friend. After an initial conversation, John was able to send him a couple samples of tissues and fluid that had been left behind by his intruders. A few days later, William contacted him before informing him that the DNA found on the tissue was unearthly. Furthermore, the biologist had allegedly claimed that the fluid given by John had a high concentration of a substance resembling chlorophyll, and was similar to the samples collected at the scene of cattle mutilations. He showcased his intentions in disclosing the findings to the public before hanging the call. When John tried to regain contact with William several weeks later, he was informed that the biologist had died. His laboratory had mysteriously caught fire, and his wife had also died a few days later. Thus, the only samples John had in his possession had disappeared. The most intriguing and well-publicized evidence to come out of the Stardust Ranch surfaced during a live web chat between John and Carrie Cassidy in 2016. When Cassidy was reviewing the footage of the interview, she noticed what appeared to be a short gray shadow figure peeking out from behind a wall. John, who had been sitting with his back toward the wall, had not noticed it. At first glance, John's wondrous claim seemed to be made up, A scenario where a supposedly otherworldly life has decided to torment an ordinary couple for 2 decades seems to be a bit of a stretch. The inability to capture their intruders on film during their stay at the property further questions the credibility of the story. John claimed to kill at least 18 of these creatures, but never presented any of their remains. He explained that they disappeared immediately after their death, making the skeptic in oneself scream hoax. The corroborating outside witnesses, however, add weightage to John's claims. Moreover, there seems to be a level of honesty in his retelling of the account. While he's been constantly charged with exaggeration, he had stood firm on his stand. People who have interviewed him state that he is sober and a convincing man who told his stories in a grounded and logical manner. Keeping that in mind, it's hard not to consider the fact that John wished to sell the property for $1 million. However, after the media frenzy, the property was sold for more than 5 times its price. So was the entire tale, perfectly constructed ploy to inflate the resale value of this property, or were the inexplicable activities so pronounced on the property that it made its new owner pay a hefty sum for its supernatural nature? I leave the answer to your judgment.